In this video module, we're covering Chapter 3. You've noticed that from the introduction, our first chapter that we cover is Chapter 3. The reason we do that is because we're going to come back to Chapter 1 and 2. So Chapter 3 is the first one that we review, and that's over property ownership. As we go through the chapters, I'm going to tell you all how many questions will be on the state exam regarding that chapter. So, first one, Chapter 3, property ownership, is going to have 6 possible questions. And we will also go over the legal description handout that you have in your package. We reference it just for a few things. Don't worry about some of the intricate details of the legal descriptions. It's really not heavily tested on, but at least you should be familiar with that document, and we'll review that just a few times during this first section. All right, I try to give a synopsis of what we're going to be discussing in this chapter. Again, like you saw in the introduction, I try to give you a Cliff's Notes versions of the material. The information as we go through it, we might skip some information. But that's okay. That's by design. It's not by accident. My job is to try to get you the vast majority of the material to be on the test so you can have a passing score with a very comfortable margin. All right? So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to refer to the board. Here's what real property. When we discuss real property is houses, trees, the things that are attached to property. That's what real property is. So the distinction between real property and personal property is if the implement is attached to the land. So what I've done here is shown you a house and shown you a tree. This property is attached. That's real property. Now what happens is that when you own real property, you own all the way through the ground to the center of the earth, theoretically, to all the way up into the sky. So, when you own real property, you own all the way to the center of earth, all the way, theoretically, you own all the way up to the sky. When you cut this tree down, for example, and sell it for firewood, that becomes severed. When it's severed, it becomes personal property. Okay, so that's the distinction. You have to understand that before we get started, that the distinction between real property and severed property or personal property is it's separated. All right. We're also going to just briefly go over some of these other figures here. It has to do with how the United States was surveyed and how you find a legal description in the state of Oklahoma. So we'll review those here in just a second. Let's go ahead and go to the material. You should be in this book, PSI, your textbook, should be on Chapter 3, and that's page 21. And I'm going to go through this information, and as I go through this information, I want you to highlight anything that I go over. It's relevant data, and I want you to highlight it. So, let's go to property ownership. 1, real property, the land, and anything permanently affixed to it. See that? It includes interest, benefits, and rights inherent in the ownership of real estate. All right. Go to the next page, page 22. Go to C1, meets and bounds. Now I'm going to refer to the board. This little dot right here is a point of beginning. When you're doing meets and bounds, that's just length and direction. It's kind of antiquated. We don't really describe property this way, but it's important to at least know what it is. And that point of beginning is POB, and all it does is essentially it says, go this direction 500 feet, go this direction, back over here, and back to the point of beginning. So that's meets and bounds. You always have to end up at the point of beginning. All right? Like I said, it's not something that you regularly deal with in the real estate industry, but it's something that you need to at least be aware of. Go to CB, boundaries may be established on the basis of actual distance between monuments. Now what these things are, these where you take a right or a left turn, it might be a barn, it might be a big tree, so it's not really very accurate. It's just kind of, like I said, antiquated way to do it. But any time that you go to this point can be a monument, and a monument can be anything. Okay, jump down to 2. Actually, it's about 2/3 of the way on chapter 22. 3B. 3B says, a township contains 36 sections. Each section is a square mile and contains 640 acres. 1 acre is 43,560. This is the information you need to know. There's not a whole lot of numbers that you have to memorize, but there's a few here that you'll have to have as you go through the course. Okay, let me explain what this is. It's kind of like a Google Maps search. You know, when you start out really big and then you define it all the way down, that's what we've done, but we've done it pretty quickly. The township contains 36 sections. So let me go over here. This is the state of Oklahoma, and this is the point of beginning, or what it's actually called the initial point. And in this, from here, in the state, if you're trying to describe real property, you start here and you go up, down, left, or right. In other words, north, south, east, or west, to find a particular parcel of real estate in the state. So you start here, and these are townships that go this way and ranges that go that way, left and right, up and down. So in order to describe a parcel of real estate in the state of Oklahoma, you go, it might say something like T2N, and there's some examples here. So you go up a couple, and then you either go left or right, east or west to a range. And so essentially what you do is you go over here, or rather you go up to here, and you take a right turn, and this is where you end up, and that's describing a township. And within that township, you have 36 sections. Each section is a square mile and contains 640 acres. So those are the numbers you need to know for your exam. Okay, so what we've done is we've gone to the state, we've gone to a township, and then we end up with this box right here. This box is 36 sections. Now here's how they're numbered. They number this way and then back down. The story goes is that whenever they were surveying the United States, they did it by horseback. And so what they would do is they would go from the last section they surveyed, they'd jump down and go this way. Then they would take their horse and buggy or whatever it was, drop down here and go this way. Okay? And there's some questions. You might be asked something about a serpentine manner. So what these sections are is they go in a serpentine manner all the way down to the 36th section. Now where do they go from there? Where do they drop down? Drop down to number 1 and do it all over again. So that's that pattern that repeats in a section. Okay, so you go from here all the way down to a section, and each one of these is 640 acres right there. All right, and we'll deal with some of these other 640 acres in a different chapter or two. All right, go to page 23, subdivision plats. Developer develops a subdivision. First thing the municipality asks for is a plat. That plat has to be drawn out, and essentially it's an engineer's design or engineer plat that includes 2 elements. So if a developer develops a subdivision, they're going to have to develop give them a plat of all the lots and the blocks. And this is how we go. This is how we end up with whatever the house that you live in, possibly. This is where we end up. So we start with T something north, range whatever east or west. And then it says from there lot and block, and they give you a subdivision name. And this is where you end up. A legal description will have all of those elements. It'll have lot and block, subdivision name, and then the very last thing you end up with is 312 South Main. In other words, that's an address. So where you live, if you live in a property or commercial property for that matter, there's a plat. That plat shows 2 things, lot and block. So if I were to, see the little red mark, little red box? If I were to describe a property in this subdivision plat, you would say lot 2, which is right here, block 2 in the subdivision, AKA also known as 312 South Main. That is a full legal description, and it is the criteria for you, or the one that you use whenever you sell real property. You have to put the full legal description. You can't just put piece of it, just the address or just the lot and block. Okay, so that's how we describe it. We go from large macro to the micro, and that's where you end up with your property. All right. Roman numeral 3, encumbrances, page 23. An encumbrance is this. First line, a charge, claim, or liability that attaches to and is binding upon real estate. What that means is an encumbrance limits your use of the property. A utility company might use your property. You have to allow them to access that utility, the gas lines, the electric lines. So that is an encumbrance. It's an acceptable encumbrance. We understand that they have a right to come on our property and do those repairs and such, but it's still an encumbrance. So an encumbrance may be good in some cases and it might be bad in some cases. For the most part, the encumbrances that we live with every day in real estate are perfectly acceptable encumbrances. Not all are bad. Let's go to some of the general classifications. B, and we'll address 3 or 4 of these. A lien, charge against the property that provides security for a debt. That's a mortgage. We voluntarily go into a bank and say, I want a loan. They put a lien on our property. That's perfectly acceptable. We're willing to do that. Go to C. Specific lien relates to a specific piece of property. There's a distinction between specific and general. You need to know that. A general lien, such as a judgment or court decree, applies to all the debtor's properties. So you can get a lien. A tax lien can be on all of your properties, or you can go out and get a mortgage that is a lien upon all your properties. Let's say you own your house, you have a rental property, and you have a commercial property. You can actually get a lien on all of those. It's kind of a blanket lien. So that's the difference between specific, one, general, multiple properties. E, this is important to note. Real estate taxes and special assessments usually take priority over all other liens. Tax liens will take priority, and that's the case in vast majority of the time. Go to 2, encumbrances that affect the physical condition and or use of the property include encroachments, easements, and restrictions. Okay, let's define this a little bit better under A. So it's 2A, a deed restriction. If you've ever built a property or lived in a property or rather buying a property, and you get this thick set of documents, that thick set of documents will have deed restrictions in there. Now, deed restrictions are sometimes, if you're building, they'll say you can have this particular type of siding, you have to have this much brick, you have to have your mailboxes all kind of look alike. Those are all things that you accept when you buy the property or build a property. So those are things that define. So it kind of limits your use when you're building a property. You have to do those things. You can't vary from those different types of products. B, easement. The most common easement is your utility companies. They have a right to access gas, electric, all those things. You're perfectly aware of them and you're okay with them coming on your property, because if they weren't able to do that, then you wouldn't have gas, electric, or anything for your house. So that's something that you accept. But yeah, the utility companies are the most acceptable, or most common rather. Go to the next page, top of 24. 2, easement in gross. This is the example of the utility company. They have a right to come onto your property and use any part of that easement. All right, so that's easement in gross. Next one, 3, is easement by necessity. Think about if you have a landlocked property. The only way to access your property is you have to have a little spot of someone else's to access your property. That's an easement by necessity. It's usually negotiated out with the homeowner, or rather the property owner, but that's necessity. The only way you can get to your property is they have to give you some way. Now you might have to spend some money on trying to figure out how you access the property, maybe some asphalt or maybe a rock road of some kind, but that is an easement by necessity. All right, go to number 5, license. Think about this. Everywhere that you are, pretty much in life, you have a right to be there. Either you own your property, in case of real estate, you might be leasing a property, which is renting a property, or you might be having, or you might get this other category, it's called license. Now, license means just what it sounds like. If you have a license to drive, what does that mean? Well, that means that you have a license to get on the roads and use someone else's property, because you don't own the street. theoretically. So that means you have a license. What about if you go to a football game? You have license to be there. And then it dwindles all the way down to something that is not good, and that's trespassing. So you're either owning property, you're renting property, you have a license to be somewhere, and if you don't have that license or you don't own it, then what are you? Well, you're trespassing on someone's property. Go to Roman numeral 4, interest in land. This is not heavily tested, the alloidal feudal system. It goes back to kings and queens and what we have now. Essentially, we have the alloidal system. Go to B, limitations in ownership. Now, these are common. You need to know these. First one, police power. Police power doesn't mean police officers. It means municipalities have a right to tell you what you can and cannot do with your property. Can you crank up your stereo at midnight, and bug all your neighbors? No, obviously you can't. Well, who's telling you can't? Well, a municipality has, quote, police powers that say you cannot do that, you can't disturb your neighbors. Can you take a really big, large truck and park it in your front yard, take the wheels off, and just leave it sitting there? No, you're not supposed to. That's some kind of a violation. You have to maintain your property. So those are police powers. The municipalities can say what you can and cannot do with your property. So that's a limit on your power, or rather, that's limiting your use. Next one's eminent domain. This is a popular topic, it seems like, recently. Eminent domain is the right of the government to go in and say, we want your property, but you have to have two things. They have to prove or not prove two things, but there are two things that have to be met. One, it has to be for public use, which means it has to be for the common good of the public. Best example are roadways, where they have to increase the road. They can take your property. The other essential element is they have to compensate you for that. So it's got to be for public use. They can take your property. There's a process they have to go through. They appraise it, and then they can purchase it. But it has to have compensation. Third is this cheat. This is whenever you die, you have no will, which is called intestate. If you have no will and you don't have any heirs, they cannot find a logical heir, then you have to, or rather the state ends up with your property. So that's a cheat. No will, no heirs. State gets your property. Top of page 25, taxation. Well, we all know what that is. Municipalities, governments have the right to tax. Next is C3, fee simple. Now, I'm going to make a little adjustment here. This fee simple is kind of a fancy term. It's a legalistic term for the highest possible, the text says it better than I can. Fee simple, A, 3A, highest type of interest in real estate recognized by law. When you own property, you own it in fee simple. Like I said, it's a legal term that says you own it fully. You aren't sharing it with anyone. So fee simple is kind of king, I guess you could say. Number 4, defeasible fee, qualified, conditional, determinable. These are kind of wordy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to help you with this. Give you an example. You might own something, but there might be something attached to it. It's the reason they call it qualified or conditional. That condition, I'll give you an example. Let's say a family gives property to a school, and that school utilizes it for playgrounds and playing football and sports and different things. They might give it or they might sell it to the school system. In that deed, it says, as long as you let the kids utilize it, no matter what, that will stay in the deed. So if the school system decides to sell that property, that stays in the deed. So forever, as long as they allow that property to be used for that condition, they can transfer the title. So they can transfer the title as long as the understanding is they can always use that little section for all their playground equipment and all that. Okay, so that's what a defeasible or conditional process is. D, know this, because there'll probably be a question on this. Go D1, limited in duration to life of life tenant or life or lives of some other designated person. In other words, you will deed this property for either their life or or your life. So it'll be good just for a certain segment of time. That's called the life estate. All right, jump over to 26. G, homestead. There's a couple reasons we have homestead. One of which is that it gives us $1,000 off our assessed value. The other thing is that if you default, creditors cannot take your house to pay for those defaults. So it helps you stay in your house, and it gives you some of that security from creditors from taking your property. As long as you're up on your mortgage and you're paying that off, that's acceptable. But if you default on something else, they can't take your homestead or you can't take your property. So it gives you $1,000 off your assessed value, plus it protects you from creditors. It's homestead law. H, adverse possession. I'm going to read just the first sentence of that paragraph. The continuous, open, hostile, notorious, and adverse use of another's property without his or her permission. Okay, this says it all for this entire paragraph. The theory behind this was, let's go back 100 years. They wanted, the state, municipalities want production from the land. So they enacted this adverse possession that if you cultivate, possibly maintain, and you do it open, notorious, and the landowner knows it, but you're making that land productive for society, then you can claim it after a statutory period of 15 years. So what it says is that if I take care of it and I do it and the person knows about it and they don't give me permission to do it, then I can make that claim after a statutory period, which is 15 years. 5, Roman numeral 5, freehold estate. From what I'm hearing and from what I understand, there's 2 or 3 questions based on the information here that'll be on your exam. You kind of think that you're having to be an expert on title, and you really don't. But there are a couple things that you need to know, and that is the difference between tenancy in common and joint tenancy. Now let's take a look at those. And this I would recommend you come back to, read over it a couple times, but there's a distinction, and it's important to understand this. And when I tell it to you, I think you'll be able to understand it pretty well. Let's go to first, let's A1 under freehold estates, Roman numeral 5, in severalty. When you own property in severalty, it doesn't mean lots of people. What it means is that it's you yourself has been severed or have been severed from others. So when you own property in severalty, it doesn't mean many, it means you've been severed from everyone else. You own it by yourself. Next, number 2 is co-ownership. That means you own it with 2 or more people, husband and wife. Maybe 2 brothers go in and buy it. Maybe 2 friends go out and buy a property. That's co-ownership. The first is A, tenant in common. Number 1, each owner holds an individual interest in severalty. And I'll have to read through some of this. 2, each owner can sell, convey, mortgage, or transfer his or her interest without the consent of the other co-owners. That is very, very important. I use the example of 3 or 4 buddies going out and buying a hunting lease. Or not leasing. Going out and buying a spot to hunt. They may not want to have that for the rest of their life. They might want to deed it to someone. They might say, hey, look, I don't want to do this anymore. I stopped hunting. And they want to just take their piece and deed it off. Sell it, convey it any way they want to. That's a tenant in common. It allows these multiple parties to go ahead and deed it off on their own. 3, Upon the death of a co-owner, the individual interest of the deceased passes to heirs or devisees. According to the will, there is no right of survivorship. That right there is the most important distinction. You can have your portion deeded to your kids. Maybe you've had this hunting lodge for 50 years and you want your kids to enjoy it. You can deed it off to your kids after you pass away. That's an important distinction between what we're going to go into now is called joint tenancy. Number one, owners have the right of survivorship. So when you go in and buy property, you say, I want to take title in a common or I want to take a joint tenancy. It's an important distinction there when you go in and purchase property. Number one, owners have the right of survivorship, which states that all title, right, and interest of the deceased joint tenant in certain property passing to the surviving joint tenants by operation of law is free of claims, heirs, and creditors of the deceased. What that's saying is that no matter what, if you took that hunting lodge as a joint tenant, it automatically goes back to all your buddies that you bought it with originally. So your portion, theoretically, goes back to them. With a joint tenant, in this case, it automatically goes to the remainder, whoever's left. The best example is a husband and wife. They take a joint tenancy, so if the wife or the husband passes away, automatically the interest goes back directly to the remainder, the remaining spouse or husband and wife. No, number two. 4 unities of title, time, interest, and possession are required to create a valid joint tenant. So you have to have, and I call it PITT, or no, I'm sorry, that's wrong. You can use that as an acronym. Possession, you have a right to possess it. You have the same interest. That means when a husband and wife buy a property, it's not like you have this part and your wife has this part. You pretty much own it together. Okay, so you have the same interest. The last two are time and title. So that means you're taking title on the same document. You purchase the property, you're all there at the closing table, and you take it on the same deed, the same title. Okay? And the last is time. Same title at the same time. So that's why you can use that acronym to remember as PIT. As we go through this class, I have these kind of quirky ways to remember things, acronyms, so you'll get used to some of these things. But it helps me remember that stuff. So when I get down there, I can memorize it, get it done, and then go on. All right, go to 27C. Tenancy by the entireties. Don't overthink this. Go to 1. Owners must be husband and wife. There's this thing that's kind of, I call it's not the best way to say it, but it's carved out for husband and wife, and it's called tenancy by the entirety. So when you see tenancy by the entirety, it's a husband and wife situation. D, community property. That is saying that the husband and wife have a community property. So there it is, number 1. Husband and wife may have sole ownership of the separate or individual property if it was owned solely by either spouse before the marriage or it was acquired by gift or inheritance after the marriage. So that becomes what they call common property or community property. All right, jump about halfway down page 27 to 5B. These are partnerships. Where you're thinking, wait a minute, this is my real estate licensing class. Why do I need to know about partnerships, general, limited partnerships, or corporations? Well, you're going to be dealing with corporations, maybe even bank foreclosures, different entities that you have to know that how they operate, and there's usually a bylaws in the corporation that say who can sign for certain legal documents. So at least you need to be aware of these things. First one is a general partnership. You need to know 2 things about general and limited partnership, or actually one on each. General, it means that all of the people in a general partnership that are involved in it are liable for the entire debt of that partnership. On the other hand, a limited partnership is your debt, or rather your responsibility, is equal to the amount of your investment. So if there are 2 people in a limited partnership, you give 50, they give 50, then you're responsible for the $50,000 that you put into it. So it's your proportionate share. That's what a limited partnership is. 6 is corporations. Go to A, ownership and severalty. Corporations are considered by law to be a single entity. So whenever you have a corporation, they are a single entity and they own things in severalty, which means they own it by themselves, severed from others. There'll be a bylaws. Every corporation you deal with will have a vice president or president that will say, yeah, I can sign for legal documents. So when you're dealing with sales contracts, the attorneys, they'll make sure that that's all acceptable. Next page, 28, leasehold estates. A leasehold estate is just how it sounds. It's a lease. When you rent a property, instead of having fee simple, what they call fee simple absolute, you have a leasehold estate. Leasehold estate, it just simply means that you're renting a property. A1, tenancy on estate for years. This is the type of lease when it says, don't let this throw you off, when it says a tenancy on estate for years, it really doesn't mean years. I don't know why they do that, but what it is a definite time period, a beginning and an ending. So if you have a leasehold estate for years, that means start and end. Okay, number 2, highlight or circle that periodic estate, which is about halfway through the sentence. That's for an indefinite period of time without specific expiration date. Notice must be given to terminate. So if you have a periodic estate, that means that you're just living there, everything's fine, you're renting out the property, but there is no expiration date. The only way to end that tenant or that lease landlord-tenant relationship is somebody has to say, okay, I'm done. Here's 30 days, you need to move out, or hey, here's 30 days, I want to move out. So that's the periodic estate. So there's leasehold, and then there's that periodic. Number 3 is a tenancy at will. That's kind of part of the periodic estate. Just says at any point in time, somebody can go, okay, I'm done, I'm out of here. Or the landlord can go, okay, I'm going to do something with the property, I'm going to sell it, I need you to leave. They can't just come in and go, okay, everybody get out. There is a statutory period that has to be met. B, number 1, gross lease. Tenant pays a fixed amount of rent while landlord pays all the taxes and insurance. Or a net lease. So know the distinction between gross and net. 2 is a net lease. Tenant pays rent plus all or part of the property charges. So a gross lease, tenant pays a fixed rent, landlord pays everything else. On the net, the tenant pays the rent and all or part of the portion of the entire maintenance. Okay, now after every chapter, there is a section called Other Important Terms. I will highlight every one of the ones that you need to know. First one, alphabetical. These are all alphabetical on all these chapters. Go to F. That's cloud on a title. Think about a cloud. It's kind of gray and scary, and you'd rather have sunshine. It's the best way to describe it. Cloud on the title encumbers things. You have to remove the clouds before you can transfer your real property, or in other words, sell the property. You have to remove that cloud. The next one is K, fixtures. Remember I said everything that's attached to here on the board of your house? Everything within your property, light fixtures, things that have been attached, if you've screwed it in, mounted it in, cemented it in, that means it's supposed to stay with the property. They're called fixtures. Fixtures means it stays. So that's what fixtures are within that property. L, good consideration. If a mom and dad give $10,000 to their kids, that's called good consideration. Okay, valuable and good. Valuable consideration and good consideration. Go to P, novation. A novation is taking a contract, original contract, deciding that you want to just change everything, go back to square one and replace that contract. That's called a novation. So you take it, theoretically tear it all up, say let's start over, and you've replaced that contract. The last one is R, and that's quiet title action. The thing you need to know about this is it pretty much fixes clouds on the title. Attorneys will, if there's some problem they can't address in some way, then they do what they call a quiet title suit, and it kind of just makes things go away. You know, I might be an oversimplification, but just remember a quiet title action helps those clouds go away by doing a quiet title suit, and then we can go ahead and close on the property. That concludes chapter 3.